Now, if you haven't noticed, one of the ways I like to do a youth talk is I like to break it into 3 parts. And I like to give the menu of what's going to be said up front. Well, here's the menu for this morning, all right? A pandemic, not our pandemic, a pandemic, a mother's face, interesting, and a really big word, ecclesiology, which I will share with you what that means, okay? So let's do the first one, a pandemic. How many of you in middle school or high school have learned about the Black Plague? Anyone? How about adults? You know what that is at least, right? Okay, there we go. Well, the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, spread through Europe in the 1300s or so. And as it spread, it not only was in Europe, but it crossed the English Channel and spread into England and Scotland, Ireland. I mean, it was devastating, and you didn't know who had it. One of the reasons why some of the doctors back then had these crazy faces with these really long noses is because during that time they associated the bad smell with death. And so they thought they could protect themselves from a pandemic by having a nose stuffed with flowers and perfumes. Because as long as we didn't smell the death, we wouldn't be subject to it. So those are some creepy faces that sometimes you see at Halloween. But during the 1300s, there was a woman that I really enjoy. Her name's Julian of Norwich. You may know her. Well, maybe not personally. Anyways, she lived in northeast of London in a town called Norwich. Great job. Come on, people. It's after 9 a.m. Now, when she was there, the bubonic plague was booming, and people were terrified of going outside, but fortunately for her, she was already living in a convent. And while she was in these rooms, some sickness came over her. We don't know for certain if it was the bubonic plague, but death inched up on her. And in her journals, it writes about how she lost feeling in her feet, and then her legs, and her lower body, and it crept up towards her face, and then she says that she felt like darkness was closing in all around, and so she couldn't see much. And she became within inches of death right around the year 30. She was about 30 years old. And at this point, her mother came, because they thought she was about to die. So they called Julian's mother. And Julian's mother came over and started tending to her and praying for her and giving her food and washing her face and just generally consoling her in what they thought was going to be her deathbed. Well, in the midst of all of this, Julian actually regained health. She came back to robustness and she lived into her later years. But it's so profound, because that's the next thing. That was the pandemic part. Now we're talking about a mother's face. Well, while the world was closing in on her, the only thing that she could really focus on was her mother's face, which was a look of tenderness, of unconditional love, infinite positive regard, care. And so when she regained health, she started writing these very beautiful things about how the love of God is actually maternal, not just paternal. And so when I read some of her pieces, some of her writings last summer at the start of our pandemic, it was so beautiful reading these passages that, to be honest, the male theologians don't get it right, but she did. The face of God is always looking at us with unconditional love, with infinite positive regard, with tenderness, with care, with zero desire to shame, blame, exclude, hate. The face of God is a beautiful thing. And for Julian, she experienced it through her mother. Now, Mother's Day is sometimes complicated because sometimes some of us don't always have the best mothers. Sometimes our mothers maybe passed away when we were younger. But you know what? That brings me to the last part, ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is the fancy word for words about the church. we can be the face of God to each other. A church does well when every decade of life is looking at each other with infinite positive regard, with unconditional love, with a tenderness that just says, yes. And so sometimes churches, we sometimes forget that the love of God is maternal. I mean, today's Mother's Day, obviously. But did you know? I found this out. Babies have a focal point of 9 to 12 inches. Babies can't see much more than that distance, which is the distance of when a mother's holding them, eye to eye. So one of the most profound things that we can do for one another, yes, preach the gospel, use words, but my goodness, may we learn from Julian, may we learn from God, may the young to the old and old to the young, may we all be the face of God to one another. And when we do that, let's be honest, how many of you have ever actually seen a small child, like really small, and you're like, that's the face of God right there, and just joyful, and it's unconditional love. That is why Jesus says, take and learn from them, for theirs is the kingdom. So this Mother's Day, be thankful for the mothers or mother figures that you had. So let's pause for 30 seconds. We're going to do what Mr. Rogers does sometimes. For the next 30 seconds, think of someone who has looked upon you with the face of God. Could be a mother, could be a mother figure. But for the next 30 seconds, let's sit in silence as you remember what it feels like to be looked at with the face of God. I'll watch for 30 seconds. Ready, set, go. We just went 10 seconds longer than I expected. But it was easy. So, may you, this Mother's Day, give gratitude for the mothers or mother figures that you've had. And may we all have a high ecclesiology and learn to give the face of God to one another. Amen.